Hey everybody, it's Overkill here with another episode in the Total War Warhammer Future Faction series. So today we are going to be taking a look at the Ogre Kingdom. So I was originally trying to make a video about the Wood Elves, but I couldn't quite find the information that I wanted quickly enough. So I'm going to take the time to actually find information for that faction, but in the meantime, we have some factions that we can actually get done. So today, of course, we're taking a look at the Ogre Kingdom. So what makes them so unique? Well, they are the lowest man count they have the lowest man count in Warhammer. Yep. On the tabletop, they definitely have the smallest army of any of the factions due to the fact that all of their models are pretty huge. Their models are very tough, all of which having multiple wounds. So on the tabletop, a human, an orc, a dwarf, a zombie, anything have one wound. So if they get wounded, they die. But all ogres at least have 3 wounds. So you can see that every one ogre is basically worth a person, essentially, but even then, they're still tougher, and stuff like that. The ogre army is composed of bulls, which are your basic ogre, iron guts, which are backed up then by noblars, incredible monsters, and artillery, and very strong characters. They are unstoppable nearly on the charge. All of them in the tabletop get special charge rules, so in Total War Warhammer, when they're put in the game, they're definitely going to be a very charged focused army, so watch out for that, or do that if you're playing as them. They have a unique magical lore known as gut magic, more on that later, and they are the easternmost main faction in Warhammer, that main factions being the ones that have army books in the tabletop. So with geography, the ogres live in the mountains of Morn, which upon a first glance look barren and inhospitable, but it is quite the opposite. Varying amounts of life call every point of the mountains their home. In the uppermost mountains live the Yetis, slightly below are the mammoths, further than that elk, saber-tusks, rhinoxen, and more mammoth herds, and of course the ogres live there. The mountains used to be the home of the Sky Titans, an ancient race and precursor to the giants we know of now. They were intelligent and incredibly powerful. During the reign of the Sky Titans, animals flourished and the Titans stayed in their mountain holds, choosing to stay out of the affairs of the rest of the world. But soon enough a great comet struck the earth in the Great Plains in the east. What followed spelled the end of the Titans, as uncountable numbers of ogres fled from that place to the mountains. They flooded over the small-numbered Titans and ultimately destroyed their civilization and enslaved any who they let live. These would be the ancestors of the slave giants the ogres use in battle today. The lands of the Ogre Kingdom is too mountainous for significant agriculture to develop. As such, the ogre race is mostly carnivorous, but vegetable matter, usually from nearby valleys, is consumed with equal zeal. Most flora and fauna inhabit such valleys, sheltered from the brutal winds that ravages the already delicate ecosystem. There, small groups of ferns, trees, and lichens manage to eke out a living in the dire climate. So basically the Mountains of Morn are pretty accurate in their name. They're not a very nice place that you want to live. So we now move on to culture and the hierarchy of the Ogre Kingdom. So starting with culture, the Ogre Kingdoms are split into countless tribes. These tribes are led by tyrants, the strongest ogre of said tribe. Young bull ogres challenge him for the leadership of the tribe. These challenges take the form of duels which take place in the tribe's maw pit, a stake-lined pit into which pieces of red meat are thrown as an offering for their god. All the tribes are in turn ruled by an over-tyrant. Although the over-tyrant's rule is supreme, the tribes are very independent and are constantly at war for territory and resources. The ogre culture is described as being oriented around eating, and as such most ogres sport large guts and they worship a god known as the Great Maw. The ogres venerate and fear it in equal measure. The priests of the Great Maw, known as butchers and slaughtermasters, also fulfill the roles of cooks for their respective tribes and supervise their religious holidays, which consist mainly, and sometimes solely, of gigantic banquets and pit fights. The Great Maw really isn't a deity at all, but just a simple comet of great size that hit the ogre's original homeland. It is theorized by scholars that due to the ogre's small brain and extreme tendency to over-exaggerate things, the ogres believed the comet was a vengeful god-like being who ate the ogre race and their lands as punishment for their sins. Scholars also theorize that when it hit, the force of the impact was so devastating that the crater it left was miles long, and the impacting force made many rock formations to spike out in the outer rim of the crater, creating the illusion of a giant gaping maw. The ogres take their appearance very seriously, and some ogre children are born with no paunch and are sacrificed to the Great Maw by either being thrown into pits, becoming the bloodthirsty gorgers, or cast into the snowy peaks, becoming creatures of the ice, fierce beasts and peak dwellers, presumably the Yetis. The ogres are served by noblars, a small species of greenskin. They are smaller than typical goblins and play the role of pets, servants, and on the battlefield cannon fodder. Nobblers don't make good eating. Ogres find that they hardly have any meat on them. Many ogres pick a favorite nobbler, and it is identified by a bite mark that is bestowed upon its right ear. In a dispute over the ownership of a nobbler, it is customary for both ogres to take a bite out of the left ear. Who the bite matches is clearly the owner. It is considered a grave insult to eat an ogre's favorite nobbler, and in fact, it was this mistake that caused Scrag the Slaughterer to lose his hands after his tyrant cut them off and ate them as punishment for serving his nobbler as a meal. So now we move on to religion. So, as mentioned earlier, the ogres worship the Great Maw, essentially a crater in the eastern plains that is so deep that it leads to the center of the world. It is also speculated that due to the ogres' constant worship of this deity, this god has manifested within the warp itself, as evident for the ogres' unique use of gut magic. Now it is the main deity being worshipped in the Mountains of Morn. Ogres have become a restless race, forever seeking to escape from that whisper in the back of their minds that pulls them back to their gluttonous yet insatiable god. No distance is great enough to escape the pull and lure of the Great Maw. No ritual or feast can fully appease its eternal appetite, and whilst it's hungry still, its barbarous sons will feed and feed and feed until they consume the world. Butchers are the ogre equivalents of shamans or holy men, and they lead trivial rituals to the Great Maw. Blood-covered and primal, butchers prepare feasts, which for the ogres are the most religious of all events. Eating and worshipping are considered the same thing. While the Great Maw cannot ever be truly sated, a butcher's best offerings can somewhat lessen the eternal gnawing within an ogre's gut. Ogres of the Firebelly tribe do not worship the Great Maw. They worship the Firemouth, which is similar to the Maw, except the fact it is a volcano. So due to this, ogres of the Firebelly tribes become shamans simply known as Firebellies, who have access to a wide range of magical spells involving fire. So the Ogre Kingdoms have a pretty simple way of living, pretty simple religion, so it didn't take much time to actually get through all of their information. So now we're going to move on to the roster. So first off, we just take a quick look at what, or who I believe will be the legendary lords. So there's only really two options for this anyway, because the ogres don't have many characters. So I'm going to go ahead and say Greasus Goldtooth and Scrag the Slaughterer as the legendary lords, as Golfag the mercenary is a hero, and he's not really a leader of the ogres. He sells himself out as a mercenary to other people. And Breg the Gutsman is just a character. He's not really a big army leader, a special guy like that. So Greasus Goldtooth and Scrag the Slaughterer, more on them later. So first off, we're going to start with the lords, and as you can, of course, while I was talking about that stuff, there was a roster on the screen. So first in the lords, we have the Tyrant. Now the Tyrant, as we mentioned earlier, are the leaders of ogre tribes, and they are very powerful. The rank of a Tyrant is not hereditary. It is literally taken by whoever can kill the former Tyrant. So it's always up for dispute. Ogres are always fighting for it, and yeah. Now, Slaughtermasters are the basically second in command of certain tribes. They are the main cook of the tribe and also the main magic caster and shaman and priest, essentially. So any connection with the Great Maw really comes through the Slaughtermaster, and of course they have to prepare the biggest feasts to really satiate their god and themselves, of course. And of course on the field of battle they're going to be very powerful, having access to the lore of the Great Maw, the lore of undeath, the lore of heavens, the lore of death, and the lore of beasts. So they're very versatile. So we then move on to heroes. So we have Bruisers. Now Bruisers are basically a retinue that the Tyrant keeps around. They're the other most powerful ogres in the tribe, and usually they are related to the Tyrant. Now, just like the Tyrant spot, ogres do fight for the rank of Bruiser, and if anyone can fight a challenge against a Bruiser, they automatically take their spot. Bruisers are very powerful, and of course, as I mentioned, they are basically the second most strong class of ogres in a tribe. Next we have Butchers, which are just a step down from the Slaughtermaster. They are essentially the apprentices of Slaughtermasters, so you can imagine a Slaughtermaster would have a retinue of Butchers along with him at all times. They help prepare they help to prepare cooking the feasts and such, and of course they can cast magic as well with the lore of the Great Maw, and as well as the other lores that the Slaughtermaster can use: beast, death, heaven, and undeath. Next we have the Firebelly, which are another class of wizard in the ogre army. They are a bit more simple though, as they only have access to the lore of fire and undeath. So these are ogres of the Firebelly tribe, as we mentioned earlier in the culture part, or in the religion part rather. So these guys are not mercenaries per se, but armies will, recruit them into their, or tyrants will recruit them into their armies to just be able to cast extra magic, and the fire magic that they use is very potent, of course, and is very useful on the battlefield. So fourth and finally, I have the Hunter. Now, I'm not quite sure how CA are going to handle heroes in Warhammer. I don't know if we're going to have more than 3, as agents in the other Total War games have only been limited to 3. So one of these 4 might be left out. But the Hunter are usually isolationists that have abandoned their tribe to live higher up in the mountains. They hunt animals, and they have a special bond with the animals. So you'll notice that a lot of the beasts can accompany or be mounted by a hunter, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But they are usually armed with pretty great weapons. They have harpoon crossbows, huge harpoon pike type weapons. It's very interesting. So then we move on to melee infantry, and the only real melee infantry unit we have are the Nobblars. And Nobblars are a lesser known race of greenskins. They are smaller than the typical goblin, and they are the slave servants of the ogres, essentially, in return for the protection of the Nobblar race. In battle, they are next to useless, as they're smaller than goblins, so they can't really do much, but they are very good for soaking up enemy fire and drawing attention away from the more powerful ogres, and that's essentially what they're used for. So then we move on to melee monstrous infantry. So we have ogres. Now, ogre bulls are just the run-of-the-mill ogre. They have a few options for armament. They can either have an iron fist and a hand weapon. An iron fist acts as a shield, essentially, that can also, punch. You can punch people with it, or they can have two hand weapons. So not two-handed weapons, but two-hand weapons, as in they have a weapon in each hand, so that they do more damage. They swing a bit more, stuff like that. So we then move on to Iron Guts, and Iron Guts are a more elite version of the bulls. They have more armor. They're heavily armored all over their body. They carry great weapons, so things like big hammers, scythes, axes, stuff like that. Big weapons that are just used to absolutely demolish anything that they charge into. But of course, it comes at the price of not having the Iron Fist if you arm a ogre like that. So they're a bit more susceptible to just being, well, actually, there's no point in even say that. All ogres are very weak to missile fire. Let's just get that out of the way. They're very big targets, so they're going to soak up a lot of fire. So it's going to be interesting to see how they actually manage to get across the battlefield in Total War. We then move on to man-eaters. Now, man-eaters are very veteran ogres that have decided to leave their respected tribe and travel the world. And they return in numbers to fight for ogre tyrants, of course, whenever they are called upon. And you can see from the models, they are all different from wherever they've went. They've adopted the clothing and the weapons of whoever they went to. There's ninja man-eaters, there's imperial man-eaters, Araby man-eaters, stuff like that. It's very interesting to see. And they have a pretty big tendency to tell very boring life stories about their travels to the other ogres when they come back. So they're notoriously known for being very boring to the other ogres. But on the battlefield, they're, of course, a lot more elite, and they're very powerful indeed. So then finally, for melee monstrous infantry, we have the Yetis. Now, the Yetis are believed to be a subspecies of the ogres after so many have been cast out into the mountains by their tribe for being un-ogre-like, essentially, not having the right physical dimensions, I suppose. And yeah, they've just been cast into the mountains to live in solitude or die, of course, and it has changed them into a completely different race, essentially. So for ranged monstrous infantry, we have the lead belchers. Now, lead belchers are bulls that carry cannons. So yeah, they're a relatively new type to the warrior society, or the ogre society, in which, from doing mercenary work for chaos dwarfs or finding them from the remains of an unlucky enemy artillery team, they've been able to earn themselves a cannon that they can use in the form of a two-handed gun. And basically, these are just used to just destroy enemy morale, fill the battlefield with thick black smoke that just chokes everybody, and, well, of course, do damage as they're carrying around cannons in their arms. So, very interesting indeed. So we then move on to monstrous cavalry, and we have the Mournfang cavalry. Now, Mournfangs are a strange big tusked cat-like creature. It's interesting. They're not quite cats, but they're kind of similar to that. I don't know. But either way, these are the biggest cavalry in the game. Not biggest unit on a mount, but biggest cavalry unit. And I can just tell you that they're going to be absolutely huge in the game when they're added. And they're very powerful. These guys can these guys are going to flatten entire units of like humans on a charge. They're that powerful. So it's going to be very interesting to see how many are in a unit in Total War. whenever they're added, and I'm very excited to see. And you can see that they have a few options. They can be added. They can be armed with hand weapons and iron fists, or they can have halberds. So that's going to be very cool. So we then move on to monsters. Now for the first monster unit, we have saber tusks, and saber tusks are saber-toothed tigers essentially. You can bring them in units of their own, or they can accompany a hunter. And these are very good for taking out enemy artillery and targeting weaker enemy characters. So these are going to be like your really fast single kind of guys that go around taking out artillery crews and such with their quick slashing and biting attacks and all that. It's going to be very interesting to see them. We then have gorgers, and gorgers are ogres that have been cast down into pits to die because of either being banished or just being born as a deformed ogre, essentially. And you can see that living down in the caves that they've been cast into has turned them into great, horrible beasts that are they're not being fed the way ogres should, so they're absolutely crazy. And they are just bloodthirsty animals. As soon as they see something, they're just going to go after it and try to kill it and eat it. And it's going to be very cool to see them unleashed onto your enemies in Total War. So we then have giants, and giants are slaves to the ogres. Unlike some other factions like the orcs and chaos, who just accompany or have giants in their armies, these are slaves, and they're basically the children, great-grandchildren, grandchildren, whatever, of the Sky Titans, which we mentioned earlier, who were a race of giants. Now these giants, of course, aren't educated, they aren't smart like the Sky Titans were. They've just deformed into this horrible, sad race that just only lives to be used in war by the ogres, essentially. So we then have Stonehorns, and Stonehorns are ridden by a Beastmaster or a Hunter. And these are just great big bulking monsters that their skin is stone, literally, and they have huge horns coming out of their head where they just charge into things and just rip them apart with their stone claws or just bash them with their tusks or their horns and such. They're awesome on the tabletop, so I would imagine that they're going to be very devastating if they can get into combat in Total War. That's the thing, though. A lot of these units aren't super fast, and they're very big, so they're going to be very weak against, say, the dwarfs in the Empire, who are just going to be constantly shooting at them. It's going to be interesting to see how they're balanced. They're, of course, going to have lots of health and be very tough in Total War, so here's hoping that they're very powerful. So then finally for monsters we have the Thunder Tusks, and the Thunder Tusks are big mammoth-like creatures that have tusks that go from their very high up head all the way down to the ground basically, and they can breathe pure, like, just freezing frost breath, and it's so powerful that it literally just freezes people to death just by them being breathed on, essentially. And of course they're very powerful creatures. They are ridden by a duo of ogres who either shoot crossbows down at them or just stab them from above with their long spear weapons. It's going to be very cool to see. They're going to be very powerful against massed infantry, of course. So we then finally move on to artillery, and first we have the Iron Blaster, and the Iron Blaster is just this huge cannon mounted on this carriage. They are the largest and most powerful black powder weapons in the old world. And they were originally created by the Sky Titans, but of course with their fall, the ogres claimed these guns for themselves. The Iron Blaster is loaded with regular-sized cannonballs in the same way as an Empire cannon might be loaded with the grape shot. It proceeds to fire with a blinding flash and a truly deafening roar, the byproduct of vast quantities of black powder. Each cannonball is propelled at a sufficient speed to smash through the stony hide of a war sphinx, leaving no chance to the humanoid soldiers. Indeed, the pulverized remains are impossible to identify from each other. For the sake of extra mobility, the Iron Blaster is mounted upon a Rhinox. So that's pretty cool, as you can tell. But that note that says it's loaded with regular-sized cannonballs in the same way that it's loaded with grape shot. The cannon is so large that the ogres put regular-sized cannonballs, multiple cannonballs, into this cannon as grape shot. So you can imagine how devastating this is going to be. It's literally firing like anywhere from 5 to dozens of regular-sized cannonballs, so imagine the power behind that. It's going to be crazy. So just to finish off this roster, we have the Scrap Launcher. Now, the Scrap Launcher is a Noblar weapon, and it's basically akin to a stone thrower or catapult. However, the metal barrage unleashed every time the Noblar invention fires tends to scatter in a dispersed rain of iron, hitting more soldiers than a trebuchet ever will, or a catapult. Also, some of the blades launched might accelerate so much that no hide or armor will be able to stop one, making this war machine very deadly indeed. So basically, they just throw spears, swords, axes, anything that they can find, scraps of metal, and they just launch it right into the air and it rains down. So basically, it's going to be simulating arrow fire from the sky, only it's big metal scraps that are going so fast that even armor, like the strongest armor, it'll go through just because of the way physics works. So these are going to be very cool to see. Of course, being crewed by Noblars, if anybody attacks it, they're going to be dead, basically. So it's going to be very interesting to see how CA implement the scrap launcher into the Ogre roster when they're added, of course. So to finish off this video, we have the legendary lords. So this is my opinion. I highly doubt that Goldfag and Bragg the Gutsman, there we go. I highly doubt that they'll be legendary lords, although they could be. I could be surprised, who knows. But first off, we're going to talk about Greasus Goldtooth. Now, Greasus Goldtooth is the current Ogre Over Tyrant, and he is definitely an Over Tyrant indeed. Now, his former title is Trade Lord, Greasus Tribe Stealer, Drake Crush, Gate Crasher, Horde Master Goldtooth, the shockingly obese. And he was one of the many whelps sired by the infamous Goth tyrant of the Goldtooth tribe. Like his brothers, Greasus grew up to be strong and fat. Unlike his brothers, however, he killed and ate his own father, and after assuming the tyranthood of his tribe and feeling the need to prove himself, Greasus demanded tithes from other kingdoms. They all refused, of course, because why would they give him anything? But they soon learned that Greasus was the greatest Over Tyrant of all time, and his dream was to rule the Ogre kingdoms, and he knew that to do this his deeds must be legendary. So he set out to conquer the nearby tribes single-handedly. The first to fall met their fate during a midwinter feast. Scaling the mountain above their valley, Greasus heaved boulder after boulder, roaring oaths at the top of his voice until an avalanche of wet snow and rock buried the tribe alive. So you can see he's a very dedicated dude to what he's trying to do, but that was years ago. That was when he was young. Now Greasus is older, larger, louder, and richer than ever, and of course, fat. And his coffers are so filled with gold that Noblars can't even count. It's just growing so fast. He now claims that he is too rich to walk, and so instead he chooses to recline on a living throne of Noblar bearers who haul his esteemed bulk about, many expiring from the effort. Yet Greasus's rampant success has not diminished his greed or his all-consuming desire to conquer everything he sees. So he has a living mount of Noblars, guys. That's how powerful this guy is, and he's very fat, as you can see from the pictures. So, I mean, of course, it's just obvious that he's going to be the legendary lord, the faction ruler, because that's what he is. So, yeah, very interesting. It's going to be interesting to see him on the battlefield. Of course, he's going to be swinging his huge mace that he has there. So, yeah, very cool guy. So then we move on to Scrag the Slaughterer. Now, Scrag is the legendary prophet of the Great Maw, also known as the Gore Harvester and the Maw that Walks. He drags around his massive meat pot behind him, which is attached to his back with a series of painful tearing hooks and chains. Scrag hacks and rips at his enemies in a glorious blood-fueled dedication to the Great Maw. In his wake, he leaves a trail of dismembered limbs and body parts, which is the duty of his Gore Noblars to retrieve and deposit into his cauldron. So you may be looking at Scrag and be like, what the hell, does he have weapons for arms? Well, yes. He made the mistake of cooking his tyrant's favorite Noblar and feeding it, or attempting to feed it to him. So the tyrant cut off Scrag's hands, ate them, and then kicked Scrag down into a pit to be eaten by the Gorgers, essentially. But Scrag, being the badass that he is. Oh, also they chained his cookpot to him and threw him down with it, so yeah, there was that. But Scrag took his cleavers, drove them into the stumps where his hands used to be, and ever since then he's just been a badass. So he ends up killing all the Gorgers that ever attack him, and actually kills the leader of a Gorger tribe that he was thrown to, basically. And he ends up leading this Gorger tribe to the tribe of his former tribe, and he slaughters all of them and personally eats the tyrant. So yeah, he's a bit of a badass. Of course, he's a great shaman for the lore of the Great Maw, and that is the only one that he can use because, well, he's the prophet. He's very special with what he does. But yeah, he's going to be crazy to see, and you can see the model form is just absolutely amazing. The gore pot behind him and his very poorly attached weapons in his arms are just absolutely disgusting looking, and it's going to be very cool to see him on the battlefield. So yeah, guys, that has been the Ogre Kingdoms faction video. I hope you enjoyed, and hopefully you managed to learn something about this very, very awesome faction. Now, of course, I did this video mainly because I really wanted to, because it's the 6th army that I actually collect models for. The other 5 being the 5 factions that we can play as in Total War Warhammer. So that was very convenient that they chose those 5 factions. That makes me very happy. So hopefully the ogres get added soon, although of course they will be interesting to add in because you have to go east, very awkwardly east, where there are no other main factions. So it's going to be very interesting. The only reason I'm even bothering mentioning them being in the game is because CA have said that they're going to represent all of them in some way. So my hopes are, of course, that we can see them as a playable race. But anyway, guys, thank you for watching. I hope you look forward to the next episode because I will see you then. Goodbye.